lived there from the time I was born, in 45, until I was 23.
My mom and dad moved into the camp probably in 1945, 46. Lived there until 1993.
And my dad didn't work for Tidal Pipeline Camp, but he worked for Producers Development Company, and he went to work for them in 1950 and worked for them until Exxon took over the company, and that was 1970.
Okay, our camp only had 4 camp houses, and we didn't live in any of them. And you went up the hill, and there was a lot of houses up there. And I lived in one of them, and Charlie and them lived in another. And
yeah, I had I had 2 older brothers, and one of the neatest things probably about living in the camp, there were a lot of children, and all different ages, and
boys.
Mary Ann was the only girl for a long time, and you can imagine how we all spoiled her. So, but it was a great place to live. Everybody had everything in common. We didn't have anything other than a lot of love from our families and from our neighbors, and so as I look back on that, I learned a whole lot about life, and so I will not ever regret growing up where I grew up.
Well, the thing about growing up in the oil field was that your situation may have been a little bit different because my dad worked for a different company, but they didn't make very much money. But we had no expenses. The oil company owned our home, so we didn't pay any rent. The oil company furnished us with gas to heat our houses. We did pay a little electricity bill, but then we had our own water well, so we didn't pay a water bill. And then there's a whole nother subject about drip gasoline that we used to run our cars.
Well, we owned our houses, and our parents paid $1 a year for the land to rent the land that we lived on, and I think our parents were furnished with all the utilities. I don't know if they paid any.
We had all utilities and paid $1 a year, as Mary Ann mentioned, to a gentleman by the name of Mr. Allen, and we have no idea how long he owned all that property, but later on through the years, he made an offer for all of us to be able to buy plots of land from him, and I think nearly every family bought some property from him and kept their house on it. And all of our houses were known as shotgun houses. Single wall, no insulation. We can all remember getting up on cold mornings because all the homes were on cinder blocks, and you can imagine how cold it would be. And thank goodness we had good dads that would get up and light the fires for us. And Mary Ann and them had a old-timey stove in their living room that kind of heated the whole home, if I remember.
Well, my dad and the boys were fortunate enough to go in and get dressed in front of the heater, but me being the daughter, I had to stay in my room and freeze. But some of the things that we did is we had a lot of ice cream suppers. We had a lot of potluck suppers. And once a month we had a quilting bee, and it was held at my house because we had the biggest den. And I don't know if you know, the women roll the quilt up and then they roll it back down. And to tell you just how wonderful the women were is one Christmas I was getting a doll for Christmas, and instead of making on the quilt, they made doll clothes for me. And the neighbor, he made me a wardrobe for their clothes. But they also played 42 in our house, and I would think we maybe had, 6 card tables.
Probably.
And they played 42, I think, every Saturday night.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't even know how to play 42. Let's see. So you had Easter egg hunts, and my older brothers, who are 13 and 11 years older, said that they used to have a tennis court out there. I don't remember it.
Yeah, I remember the tennis courts. They were by an old warehouse that They eventually tore down, but had a lot of socials.
That was by y'all's house.
Uh-huh. So it was a great place.
Well, we had Easter egg hunts. Do you remember
Right,
Easter egg
right.
hunts? And we used to go down to we would go down to the camp, and they had a little building that had a Coke machine and a water fountain and a dispenser for salt tablets. And it was a big treat to go down there and get a Coke, and they were what, a nickel?
Oh yeah, the hardest part about all that was finding a nickel, and so we all kind of would sell bottles and do things like that in order to get a nickel to buy a Coke. And so we had a good time down at the Coke machine and down at the lower part of the camp where the big engines were that pumped the oil out of the oil pipelines. And so a lot of fond memories. We just had a great time. The road that divided the houses in the upper part of the camp, the road was the main attraction because that's where we played everything. And so everybody, all the kids would congregate out there and play touch football or play marbles and things like that. So it was a great place to be.
Yeah, and we also had cows on that road because that was before the cattle law.
We had cattle guards.
And we were always barefoot. And one of the hazards of that was getting sandworms.
Sandworms.
And you'd get them in your feet, and they itched. Oh my goodness, they itched bad. But I think I got them more than anybody. I don't know why.
You did, and also the grass burrs.
Oh yeah.
When we would walk down to Crystal Creek, you had to go through this field of grass burrs, and of course, if you were barefoot, you would just run real fast to see how fast you could get through the grass burrs without them.
And we were
sticking to
barefoot
your
all the
feet.
time.
Yes.
That was our entertainment, to go to the swinging bridge. Everybody loved the swinging bridge. And we would go down there and play in the creek, which was maybe ankle deep.
Ankle deep, probably.
Now, the older boys told me that they used to have a swimming hole down there, but I guess it grew up by the time that we were old enough to be allowed to do that.
I don't remember any water being deep
No.
enough
Deep
for a
enough.
swimming hole.
No, it was on the other side of the creek. But we would go down there and we would walk pipes. My cousins and I used to get cows to chase us, and we'd climb up a tree, and then we were so dumb we had to wait till they left to get down. But Charlie and them did, the boys dug caves back behind the house.
Right.
Oh my goodness, I'm surprised they didn't fall in on them.
Right.
But at that time, you know, kids were allowed to do anything. We stayed out all day long and came home for lunch and came back for supper and went back outside. And if we were in the house, we were being punished. I mean, unless it was Saturday morning and we watched cartoons. But
I don't recall how many families lived in the camp at one time, but we all remember when we got our first telephone. And there were like 15 different families on the line, and so everybody had a separate ring. But some of our mothers always thought it was their ring, and they'd pick it up and kind of hear the other conversation, you know. And so we have fond memories of getting the first telephone, and then after that, you know, probably it was in the mid-50s when we got our first TV. So man, when we got our first TV, everybody was thrilled to death because we could watch TV and watch Roy Rogers and Cisco Kid and all those people that we all have fond memories of. But
do you remember your first phone number?
no, I don't.
I remember mine. It was PL, and PL stood for Pleasant.
Yeah.
PL 68720.
My goodness.
I was so proud. I remember that.
Now we got our mail at the camp, at the office in the camp, and the clerk out there would come to Conroe every day and pick up our mail. Our box was 607. I do remember that.
Right.
And but one of the things we had out there was a whistle, and I don't know if the other camps had it, but if it blew, it was an emergency. And I don't remember it blowing often, but I think the only time I remember it was for my dad, you know. But everybody knew something bad was going on if that went off. And another thing they did, and I told Charlie and Luann that I think maybe they did it in town and everybody did it, but if someone died in the camp, one of the men that worked for the camp sat with them until they were buried. They stayed at the funeral home all night, and I don't know, like I said, I don't know if they did that at other places or not, but I thought that was really nice. And I know when my grandfather died that Charlie's mother watched all of us kids, so Mother and Daddy could go, and everybody just kind of looked out for everybody's kids.
Yeah, you know, as you grew up and you reflect back on that, you can remember how all of the families out there were really close, and anytime there was a crisis or a need or someone really ill, everybody pitched in and helped, and uh, that's really what represented family to me, is see how that worked. And uh, so those memories are memories that we'll never forget, because we saw a lot of people that pitched in when people were hurting and there was a real need. And so,
and they were there to celebrate the good times.
Exactly.
You know, everybody took care of each other, and I feel like all Phil people are clannish. And I think that's a good thing. I mean, I think our parents taught us to love and respect each other and our neighbors. And I think we all loved each other, you know. I mean, I feel like Charlie and Tommy and Ralph are brothers because they moved there when I was 3 months old. And so, and Charlie rescued me and Luann from my brother.
Right, several times.
More than one time. And
well, each camp, I think, must have had, you know, it was like a small community.
It was.
It was.
You know, in itself. And we all lived, I guess, about the same. I think some of us had chickens. We were pretty rural, and we had gardens.
I think everybody had a garden.
Yeah, back then they probably did.
Charlie reminded me that we had a cow.
Yeah.
They were the only ones that had a milk cow, and I
time.
think the Brookses. But the thing that we talked about the last time we got together was people killed all of their hogs on one day. And all the families would gather, and all the men would gather, and they'd slaughter those hogs, and then they'd butcher them, and then they'd salt them down, and then they'd hang them on the back porches of each home. And that was part of our food source, because we didn't have refrigeration at that time. And so the meat really was salted, and that's how we were able to preserve it. But those are the kind of things that went on, and it's good to reflect back on that, you know, because you have a tendency to kind of forget that. And so when we met the other day, we really, for about 4 hours, we had a really good time, because you can't remember it all, but you remember a lot of it.
But we reminded each other of things that we had forgotten. Right. And, you know, the women canned. You know, we had the gardens, and they put the food up, and so... and we all were poor, you know, we really, truly were, but we didn't know we were poor.
Right,
we
exactly.
We never did without anything that I know of, you know, and it was just a really good life.
One of the things that Marian's already talked about, the quilting, but the other thing the women did, they would congregate and help each other do all the ironing. If you can imagine, they'd all have all these ironing boards, and they're ironing everybody's clothes.
And we probably had the most, because we had the most kids.
Had 7 kiddos.
7.
So, yeah. So those are the kind of things that went on in the camp. And then every day was a typical day. You know, everybody would get up, and we'd all catch the school bus, and your dad would go to work, and they'd walk down to the site where all the activity would be for them. And so that was a typical day from 7 o'clock till 5:30 in the evening, and then starting to quieten down after that. So.
Well, and we all of our families always had dinner together. Exactly. I mean, as a family, you know. Right. Now, I always knew when Luann's mother was making cornbread, which was every night. And her mom's cornbread was better than my mom's, because Dad liked it real thin, and Luann's mom made it real thick.
Yeah, she did. And you ask about our houses. Our house was very small, as were all of the shotgun houses. And our house is still there, and actually the latest owner has remodeled it. My mother lived there for 61 years, Minnie Brooks, and my dad, Edgar Brooks, who worked in the oil field. He worked with Mr. Monroe. And they were the only two workers that worked for Producers Development Company in this area. And they had 2 wells. We lived among the oil. We had tanks and multiple tanks in front of our house. We had 2 oil wells just beside our house. Too bad we didn't own them. But we had a separator, a sludge pit, and everything surrounding our house. And that's what Dad saw to all of it. And it was a good time, but very small house for 5 people in the house.
Yeah.
Well, and back then, of course, we had no air conditioning. We all slept with the windows open and never locked a door.
No.
And I can remember going to sleep, and she's talking about the oil well. It would go chakunk, chakunk, chakunk all the time. And if it stopped during the middle of the night, it woke me up. And I would get up and go wake up my dad, and he'd go check it. But, you know, you just get used to living that way. And I think Steve was wanting to know when the camp closed. I'm not really sure.
I'm not real sure. You know, it was Tidal Pipeline, and then Tidewater was the overseer after many years, and then it was all eventually purchased by Texaco.
Well, Getty
Yeah.
owned it all.
Getty all, yeah.
I mean, when Dad moved up to Tidewater, they started changing everything to Getty and putting Getty's name on everything.
Right.
Yeah. Now, I believe Exxon bought Producers Development Company, and after they sold out to them, the oil company sold my dad the house for about $50. So he could get the title to the home, because before then there was no title because the oil company owned the home. So my dad never made any house payments.
I don't guess we did either,
No, we didn't. No. No.
because Charlie and his family lived across the street, and then somebody moved out and they moved next door.
Yeah.
Well, down in the camp, the superintendent was Ed Sanders, and his wife was Georgia Bell. And what I remember is Whitey Talbert, and his wife was Minnie Lee.
Minnie
And
Lee.
then Frank Kokana, and his first wife was Margaret, and then he was married to Pearl Kokana. Well, I can't remember what her name, Henderson.
Henderson.
And then, let's see, I think on the 4th house, the Hummels lived there at one time, the Swartz lived there at one time.
Right.
Vandenberg ever lived there?
Did who?
Sam Vandenberg?
I don't recall Sam ever living there. Do you? I don't think he ever, when we were growing up, he lived up by Mims. Up in the camp, well, the house that was right before ours, the Holdens, lived there first. And then the Taylors lived there. And then the Pattersons. Right. And then we were next to them. And then the Dashers were next door to us. And then the Thompsons, right? Mm-hmm. Leo Thompson, and then the Brooks house.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And across the street from us was the Pattersons before they moved. And the house right before them, the Hendersons lived in.
Right. And
the Atkinsons lived in.
Mm-hmm.
And I think at one time, did the Holdens live in that house ever, or they lived in the one beside? They lived beside me. There was another house that the road kind of veered off and like going to the swinging bridge, and the Tasers lived there.
Mm-hmm.
And at some point, some people by the name of Gates, they built a new house there. And then there was a house kind of back going toward the swinging bridge that at one time I think my grandparents lived in. And then Andy Walker, his family moved out there.
Right.
And then there was a house kind of across from Luann's house that the Wilmus lived in.
Mm-hmm.
And then Luann and them were kind of around the curve up there. And at one time, there was a trailer house that Tommy Stallworth lived in when he moved. And then
Yes.
behind
Real
Luann
close to my
was,
house, yeah.
right behind Luann's house was the Hewitts. They lived there, and then behind them was Mr. Allen,
Mr. Allen.
who was the Hewitts'
I think it was granddad.
granddad.
I think so.
Yeah.
And different people moved on later in years. They didn't work for the camp, but in fact, Tommy, Luann's brother, told us that he lived in the camp house.
In
At one
later years,
Yeah.
after he got married, he moved back into one of the vacant houses in the camp.
Right.
And the house that Charlie Patterson, his dad, bought from my uncle, Howard Ingram, who I have a picture of Howard Ingram and Whitey Talbert together. And they both work for Tidal.
All of our friends used to love to come into the camp because you had to go up and over the dike, and
Over the
you try to
dike.
go real fast, and it made your
Yes,
stomach feel real funny. And I think we spent a lot of time on that down there.
We did.
We had, I think we had 3 large tanks.
Yeah, they were big
And they had
storage
dikes.
tanks.
They had dikes all
Big,
around them.
Yeah,
And
massive.
my dad used to be, he was scared to death of snakes, and he would tell us every year, the dikes were covered with berries, and he would tell us every year, do not go and pick berries. And of course, we went and picked berries. I don't know how he thought he got berry cobbler, but we did that, and there was also a garage that they
Worked on all
worked
the
on all the
equipment.
vehicles.
Mhm.
And they had one of the things that you drive your car up on and change the oil, and
Right.
we all use that.
Exactly.
I think they had another building too over there.
Yeah, there was
by
kind of
that
a warehouse.
ramp.
Yeah, there was kind of a warehouse. Yeah.
And I think my dad did some mechanical work sometime.
Right.
I think that he didn't like to do it, but I think he did do that sometime. And actually, the camp houses were kind of in a pecking order. The superintendent was in the one closest to the
Right.
office, and I don't know if the others had titles or not.
Well, I think Frank Kokena was the office manager.
Yes, he was the clerk.
So I think he was in probably the next one.
No. He was the third one.
He was the third
The
one.
Talbert.
And the fourth one was the Swartzes, and he was their main mechanic on all the big equipment. So they had kind of a pecking order, like Marion said. And then everybody on the hill was just,
Equal.
poor.
When you talk about zip lines, I don't know if my brother had anything to do with that one or not, but we used to go swimming over at Crater Lake. I had an older brother, and he would let Bonnie and I, my sister and I, tag along with him everywhere he went. He was a good big brother, so he and some more boys fixed a zip line from one tree to another across Crater Lake, and you'd of course jump off and you'd fall in the middle of the lake.
Exactly.
And you better know how to swim, because we couldn't find the bottom. I assumed there was a bottom, but I didn't know where it was. And I told Mother later, I said, Mother, I can't believe you would let us go swimming in Crater Lake. And she said, well, I'm not so sure I knew you did.
I'm sure she didn't. I don't think any of our parents knew that. Delray used to take me everywhere, but he never took me to Crater Lake. I guess there were more protective since I was the only one out of
yeah.
6
Probably
boys.
so.
And we'd go to Peach Creek to go swimming.
Exactly.
We'd go to we had lots of fishing holes, but that was one that I'm afraid I went many times with my brother.
I can remember even during the day, my mom didn't drive. And I even remember all of us going to vacation Bible school with Luann's up to Mims because her mother drove and took us. And I can remember when I was in kindergarten that Andy Walker lived out there then, and James Vernon Meechan lived over off of Stedham Road. And his mother drove, and she would come and pick us up every day to go to kindergarten together. I don't know. I guess we went in the afternoon, or we would have ridden the bus otherwise. But we all had to ride the bus, and we rode Little Lulu.
Right.
And
yes.
I don't know if you remember Little Lulu, but it didn't have a nose, and the engine was the only ensign.
Mhm.
And Mr. Dole
Mr. Dole.
Mr.
drove the
Dole
bus. Yeah.
would let us take turns sitting on the engine.
Mhm.
Can you imagine now? What I know. And
And push the button and open the door.
Yeah, and I think that on one side of the engine was a long seat, was
I
there,
think so.
on that? And of course, we went through every camp. I mean,
Picked
we
everybody
picked
up.
everybody up,
We did hit all the camps.
every one of them.
They must have hit us early because I
Must
Yeah, we
remember
did.
going through many camps and down through Midland and all and back to the school.
And everybody rode the bus. That's just what you had to do. Whether you liked it or not, you rode the bus.
There weren't any extra cars, were there?
No, there were not. So, but I just think all in all that camp
It was a
life was
great
wonderful.
life.
It was
It was,
wonderful.
yeah.
My dad was sort of a loner out there. He worked for Producers Development Company and he tended to his own wells, his own tanks, had his own slush pit and his own pipe where he gathered the drip gasoline. And he had built a little shed out in the woods. And I don't know too much about drip, but it makes more in the wintertime than it does in the summer.
Right.
And so my brother's job before he went to school every morning, and he was fairly young, was to go out to the shed and pour up the drip gasoline that had gathered that night. And he would pour it in a 55-gallon drum. And during the winter, my dad may have 10 or 15 full drums out there. Well, I'm glad there was never a fire in the neighborhood. And he also, Dad would put a barrel in the driveway with a pump on it. So we virtually had our own gas station. And of course, if you've ever burned any drip, you would turn your car off and it would just keep running.
Keep running.
Really?
And yes, and so every once in a while we had to go get $1 worth of ethyl
Exactly.
to put in it to so it would turn off when you wanted it to turn off.
Not bad.
But that was another thing we didn't have to pay for. We didn't have to pay for gas for our cars. We got a lot of freebies back
Yeah.
You know, though, you talk about no fires. I think my little brother and Lorraine Toller set up a fire up there by y'all's house in the woods one time. Yeah, they did. I don't know what they were doing, but they did that for sure.
I have a picture that I didn't bring of me sitting on a pile of dirt, and that was they had
Dug it
tried
out.
to dredge out Crystal Creek. I don't think it worked very well, but because there was very little water in it, and some of the kids would jump off of the swinging bridge. Well, not me, because if you jumped off of it, I was chicken. If you jumped off of it, you weren't going to hit any water.
No.
You were just going to hit wet sand. That was fun, though. My sister and Marianne and I we would pack us a lunch. And I don't know that our parents even knew
Where we
just
were, probably.
tell them we were going to Crystal Creek, I guess. And like Marianne said earlier, we would just spend all day down there.
They didn't know where we were, but,
Yeah.
but you didn't have to worry about where you were then.
As long as we were home for supper, they didn't worry about us.
And they always knew what we were doing because everybody told all the camp. I used to come home, and this is after I was out of high school, and I drove my dad's car, and I was working, and we'd sit there at night because we always had dinner together, and I sat across from my dad, and Dad would say, well, so-and-so, which is probably another camp person from a different camp, so-and-so saw you speeding today. And I would say, yes, sir. And that was the end of it because where do you go? But they pretty much knew. And I know my older brothers, they had a car, but it was broken. They broke it all the time. And they knew who was going to town at what time from different camps.
Exactly.
And they would go out
Catch a
to
ride.
Porter Road and thumb a ride because they knew so-and-so was going at 6 o'clock or whatever. And I don't know if they caught a ride home or they walked.
They probably caught a ride. People, everybody knew everybody.
Because we were like 8 miles out.
Yeah.
And certainly there was not any traffic on Porter Road
No.
Not
back
then.
then.
Mhm.
I didn't even know it was 1314. I mean, all I knew was Porter
Porter
Road.
Road.
Yeah.
Yeah. And we were talking the other day, and it's really funny because I think most of our camp is buried out in Conroe Memorial, is that what it's called? By Mims.
Mhm.
And they're all in one area.
Wonderful.
And I think it's really, I know my dad bought 9 plots since he had not all that many in our family, but he sold 2 to our neighbors. And I think most of the neighbors are all right in that area, and I think that's pretty interesting. And I was telling Charlie and them that I found a quilt that was quilted in 1935. And my parents didn't come to Conroe till 42, is that what I
42, I
said?
think. Yeah.
And it's real funny because they were in Joinerville, which is out of Henderson, and the women did the quilts, and they had each square, they signed their name and they signed the date, or they put their child's name. And it's funny because it's the same people that lived in the camp where we grew up. They just transferred
That's
everybody, I guess, from Joinerville
They did.
to Conroe.
Yeah.
And I thought it was really interesting that they were all together. So, I mean, they were family for sure, to be
Exactly.
together that long. You know,
Is
we
that
were-
where you came from, Charlie?
My grandfather was involved in when they discovered the first oil well in the oil field. But he lived in East Texas, Joinerville, and never moved to the area. He always went back when everything settled down and was working for Tidewater there in Turnertown.
Back then, like I said, we didn't lock the doors and I didn't have telephones then. And James, my next oldest brother, got up, and the Holdens lived next door. And Mother said that he got up during the night and walked in his sleep over to the Holdens and got in bed with their kids. And his mother came to the fence and yelled because we had windows open. I said, "Don't worry about him. He's over here asleep. Just leave him." But it was that's how everybody took care of everybody.
Exactly.
You know, everybody loved everybody's kids. So anyway, it was great. It makes me sad that kids don't have the life we had.
Yeah.
I mean, you
It
know,
was a good time to grow up.
it was a real good time, and we all went to church on Sundays. You know, that's just what we did, and we certainly didn't work
No.
because you didn't work on Sunday, and
You couldn't buy groceries on Sunday. There was nothing to do except go to church. And most of the time, we didn't have a television. We did get one sometime in the early 50s. I don't remember when.
and I don't think it was as hot as it is now. I just
Well, we
I
were
just don't.
so used to not having air conditioning. We had a big attic fan up in the attic. Did y'all have an attic
We had
fan?
a big fan on the back porch that
Big
was
box fan.
big box fan,
That's what we had.
and it sucked in that air.
Oh, yeah.
It did. And I slept, and my room had 2 windows right beside it, and I slept with them open all the time and never thought about somebody getting in them. Who would have thought anything bad would happen out there? Because I don't think anything ever did bad happen
Never
out
did.
there.
Not to them.
We were real fortunate.
One funny thing, my dad would always do what he could, I guess, to save a penny. And when they tore down the tanks, when the oil company did away with the tanks, the oil derricks are no longer there, the tanks are no longer there. Well, Dad took he wanted to build him a garage, so he took that tank metal and he built him a garage out of it, and it still stands to this day. And on the inside, you could go inside the garage, and you could see the oil logos stamped on the metal. And of course, Dad painted it with that silver tank paint, and it's just like that today.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what year, but probably early 70s he did that.
My granny used to come out, my mom's mother, and she would wring their neck. And Frankie and Larry and I were so dumb. We thought they were chasing us, you know. And I would stand out and help them pull the feathers off, pluck them.
Yeah.
And we'd throw it in that burn barrel. Oh my goodness, that smells so
Oh,
bad.
Oh, yes.
But Luann's mother, let's see, she mowed all of her property until she was what, 90
Oh,
something.
yes, in her later life, after my dad died, Mother stayed there in the house, of course. She loved that place. That's where she had been ever since 1950. My dad died in 1982. And so we finally got Mother riding lawnmower, and it was one of those zero-turn mowers. It didn't have a steering wheel on it. But Mother loved to mow that grass, and she mowed it up until she was probably over 90 years old.
My
And she
goodness.
also had a garden.
Yes,
She
yes.
always did her own garden, and it was a good
And
garden.
it got, every year into her 90s, you know, as she got her late 80s, the garden got smaller and smaller and smaller, but she still wanted a garden. And yeah, finally I told her, the doctor said she couldn't mow anymore. And she said, well, that doctor, she didn't really care what he said. And